Against the wall.
Yeah, I know it kind of sounds like some people who may be listening, it may sound like we're un-American, like we're commies or something, but that's not true. Our government are commies. They're Bolsheviks. And you don't need to look any further than the Communist Manifesto. You don't need to look any further than the policies implemented the last 10 years or the last 30 years, the last 100 years. And as I said, if it looks like a Zionist and it smells like a Zionist, it is a central banker. And central banks have caused every boom, every bust. They fund both sides of every war. And so we're not un-American. And I say God bless Americans. Oh, amen to that. God bless Americans. Thanks, Jules, for creating that new intro for me. And that is, by the way, me speaking, if anybody wonders. I'll like to start the show saying good morning to everybody out there at ucy.tv. Thanks for joining me. This is actually just the second edition of the new Against the Wall show. It'll only get better. I'd like to take just 1 second to say happy birthday to my dear, dear, dear friend, Paul Tapetti, born on this day of infamy. Happy birthday, brother Paul. Yesterday was my grandson's first birthday, and I'd like to say happy birthday to him, that I love my daughter. I love you, dear, and thanks for listening. All right, on today's show, I have Professor, U.S. Marine, retired Professor of Philosophy at the University of Minnesota, and a scholar of 9/11 studies, and also a scholar of the murder of John F. Kennedy. You can find the professor's work at Veterans Today, and you can also listen to his show over at the Revere Radio Network. Professor James Fetzer, thanks for joining me today.
Oh, Jim, it's a real pleasure. And if you define communism as a form of government where there's constant lying to the people, where they're under complete and total surveillance, and where they're even willing to murder their own citizens to promote a political agenda, then I would have to agree that we're in the throes of some kind of government of that form, where I was embarrassed to listen to Barack Obama last night deliver one lie after another to the American people, including the claim that Bashar al-Assad had been responsible for the use of chemical weapons. He and John Kerry have continued to make that assertion. Kerry went on and on and on the other day claiming about, we know where these weapons came from, we know where they landed, and all this, and it was complete and total rubbish, Jim.
Yeah, it's a replay of 2002, 2003. And, you know, Jim, I like to use this analogy. Anybody who grew up with a younger sister or brother or younger sibling knows what happens when mom or dad comes into the room and says to you, the oldest, this better not happen or else. So anybody knows that when you go into a region like Syria, where you have players like al-Nusra and al-Qaeda, and you have, you know, secret Yemeni and Saudi Arabian Islamic mercenaries running around, and you give their opponent or their enemy a red line and say, if you do this, we'll do this. And I mean that to illustrate the fact that it would be ludicrous, it would be insane for Bashar al-Assad, who is, yes, a brutal dictator on the one hand, to gas his own people. And so that leads me to believe that you're exactly right, that the rebels are the rebels who share our values, according to Mitt Romney, did this. And
John Kerry, yeah, it's unbelievable. I mean, you're making some very nice points, Jim, including that, we have Assad has denied he used the weapons. Russia has provided a 100-page summary of evidence showing that it was not Assad who used the weapons.
Right, and they spent 4 months on their investigation, not 3 days.
Yeah. Representative Alan Grayson from Florida has explained that the intelligence is being manipulated. I mean, we've been there before. I was sent today a link to an article that was published March 21st, 2011, in which the title is Senator John Kerry, U.S. is not going to war in Libya as American international forces intervene. He was giving a very similar song and dance then. And of course, look what happened in Libya. I mean, they would probably insist it wasn't the U.S., it was NATO who did all the damage. But NATO is simply a military extension of the United States. We're all aware of that. It would have been absurd, by the way, for Assad to have used chemical weapons when his army has the rebels on the run and when on the very eve of a UN inspection team arriving in Syria.
They were actually just landing in Damascus when this allegedly took place.
Yeah. Just 2 days ago, the Wisconsin State Journal, I reside near Madison, had an article that actually contradicted all of Kerry's claims about all this being known definitively. Syria, White House, proof is elusive, but common sense shows Assad and the attack are linked, aide says. Well, that's ridiculous. Common sense says Assad had nothing to do with it, that the rebels were responsible. They would have a reason to try to create a false scenario in which it would appear as though Assad might have used these weapons as the UN inspection team is about to arrive. In fact, we have other reports that Prince Bandar of Saudi Arabia actually
I can't believe what just happened.
Yeah.
Yeah, my Skype just reset.
Okay,
Well,
are we okay
continue,
now?
James. Yeah, we're back live.
Where did I leave off?
Uh,
The point I was making, it's very embarrassing to have, Barack Obama, the President of the United States, looking at the people, the nation in the eye and lying his face off because there's a ample reason to believe that Assad had nothing to do with this and that it was the rebels who were responsible for these events. The evidence is very suggestive, including the Russian study, as you mentioned in passing. And therefore, the whole business is predicated on a false assumption. In fact, we had an article just 2 days ago here in the Wisconsin State Journal that undermines the official account. Syria, White House, proof is elusive, but common sense shows Assad attack are linked, aide says. But common sense suggests they aren't linked at all because it would have been absurd for him to use chemical weapons when he has the rebels on the run and when a UN inspection team is about to arrive.
It would be one of the dumbest things that any leader of any sovereign nation could do.
Absolutely right. It would be just a colossal act of stupidity. And I think it's fair to say that whatever his other virtues, the man does not appear to be stupid. But Obama, is playing on the gullibility of the American people to believe whatever he says. And I'm sorry to say, most Americans really get their news in sound bites. They pay attention to the networks, which are totally controlled. You won't hear from the networks, for example, points such as those you were making, namely that this rebel group is tightly allied with Al-Qaeda.
Yeah, 7 of the 9 groups known to be operating with the Free Syrian Army, yeah.
The Al-Nusra Front has committed over 300 terrorist acts and is properly qualified as a terrorist organization.
They butchered a Christian community, cut the heads off the priests, and burned their churches down in Syria.
That's completely right. Plus, we have this Free Syrian Army, photographs of them executed, shooting in the back of the head 7 Syrian soldiers they captured, and another of one of their members carving the heart out of a Syrian soldier and eating it. I mean, these are the people that John Kerry is telling us
they share our values, right, Jim?
That's right. They share our values. We must intervene on humanitarian grounds. Here's something else, Jim, that is really at the core of the matter, which is this. We have this thing called a constitution. And
what's that?
Article 6 of the Constitution grants treaties the same status under the law as the Constitution itself. We have a treaty with the United Nations, which binds us to its charter. By the UN Charter, there are only two circumstances under which a nation is allowed to attack another nation. One is if it confronts an imminent threat and therefore must act in self-defense. Second, if it has the authority of the United Nations Security Council. Neither of those conditions obtain here. In this situation, there's no imminent threat. In fact, many really question whether there's a national interest of the United States here, as Rand Paul observed in his...
Right, where's the national interest? Because we got AIPAC running all over America right now, the largest lobby in America, the Israeli lobby, and they're beating one drum, and that's the war drum.
Jim, you're right on top of this. I mean, that's really excellent because too many Americans have never even heard of AIPAC, have no idea of the extent to which Israel is dominating American politics and our intel agencies. I mean, all this NSA surveillance is ultimately being conducted through Tel Aviv and Israeli operations. I mean, they know everything about us, and I'm rather concerned.
And the Mediterranean right now is jam-packed. So is the Persian Gulf is jam-packed with NATO, with American and NATO and UN ships. And if you use the same analogy that I did, that I used earlier, Israel is the little sibling. And if we all recall, in 1967, the attack on the USS Liberty, we are ripe for something similar to happen here anytime now.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. The point I'm making, of course, is that if Obama were to go ahead and bomb attack Syria, even with congressional approval, which appears increasingly unlikely. In fact, when he asked to defer the vote, it was a vote he was virtually certain to lose. So it wasn't any magnanimous gesture on his part, but an encounter with political reality. The American people are overwhelmingly opposed to more wars. They don't realize this is more wars for Israel, but that's what it is, more wars. They've got the message. And I think between the exposure to the realities of the NSA surveillance from Edward Snowden and now, seeing Obama do this song and dance, which has been a reflection of the incoherence of American foreign policy, where we're told, after all, that al-Qaeda was responsible for the events of 9/11, and yet we're going to become al-Qaeda's air force in Syria. The situation is absurd, but since Obama took an oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, and since we do not satisfy the conditions that the United Nations Charter requires to justify a military attack, we would be not only violating international law and the United States Constitution, but the oath of office he himself took. So, the guy is supposed to have a background in the law. And he even
supposed to be a constitutional scholar.
Exactly, Jim. So how can he not know these things? Of course, given those considerations, he surely had to know that since he was not a native-born American, that he wasn't even eligible to serve as president of the United States. I mean, we're in the most bizarre situation of my lifetime with this man in this office making this kind of pitch for such a grossly improper action by the United States, which would violate international law, U.S. Constitution, and his own oath of office.
Yeah, everything about Barry Soetoro is false. I mean, my friend Phil Berg has been trying to expose Barack Obama for 8 years almost now, and to no avail. They just put together some sort of photoshopped, document and say, hey, this is it. This is our proof, and it's easily torn apart, but that doesn't matter because we're the government. He's the president.
I did a whole show on that, the Hawaiian birth certificate, 2 hours going through it, and there were all kinds of problems even with it. And it's even on its face, it doesn't look authentic. He appears to have been born in Kenya. I'm reasonably convinced of that. He lived in Indonesia and obtained Indonesian citizenship. And when he came to the United States, he appears to have benefited from various forms of scholarship and financial support because he was a foreign-born or a foreign national and not an American citizen.
I believe he was a foreign national. I believe he came here on visa at first.
And one of his first acts, Jim, as president, was to seal all of his educational records, which would have revealed this information. I mean, that's That's the height of duplicity. So, the man is totally untrustworthy. And it's ironic because, frankly, when he was initially campaigning for the office, I thought he was the perfect guy for the job. I thought because of his background in the law, because he was young, articulate, handsome, appeared to be very principled, that he was the right person to set our country back.
And he started with the Nobel Peace Prize just by virtue of the fact that he was a black man and was elected president.
Jim, that's ironic. This man actually has sent American forces into more nations than any other president. He sent them into some 15 countries in Africa alone.
Yeah, and he has, the alleged kill list. Every Tuesday they get together and decide who's going to be droned and bombed, and we're worried about, for the number. It's like the Holocaust math. The number started out as 300 children, then went to 400. Now it's 500 dead children. Yet, the ratio, the militant ratio with our drone bombing is like 44-1. We kill 44 men, women, and children who are non-combatants for every one suspected combatant. Yes. And of that, over 440 of them were children in Yemen, in Pakistan.
And these are all in gross violation of international law because these are violating the integrity of sovereign nations. I mean, Pakistan's been especially blatant, and the Pakistan government has objected to it, and completely with justification. But the United States, being the biggest bully on the block, seems to believe it. And people seem to
forget, if it wasn't for the help of Iran, we would never have a government, the Karzai government in Afghanistan. They were integral in our help when we first invaded Afghanistan. Now they're our worst enemy.
Well, and that's ridiculous. I mean, Iran is a peace-loving nation, hasn't attacked any other nation for over 300 years. I mean, its response to the attack by Iraq, which we promoted, and where Saddam Hussein used chemical weapons that we had sold to him, is the example that proves the point. In fact, they have disavowed having a nuclear weapons program. The Ayatollah Khamenei, who is the supreme leader of Iran, has declared nuclear energy for all, nuclear weapons for none. They've signed the non-proliferation treaty. They've allowed inspectors. None of that is true of Israel, which has 200 to 600 of these little beauties.
Which they won't admit, but they secretly wink their eye and say, yeah, we got them.
And in fact, it's because Israel has this vast stock of nuclear weapons that Syria was pass in its accumulation of a vast stockpile of chemical weapons.
Yeah.
And in fact, under U.S. foreign policy regulations, we should not be sending any foreign aid to a country that has weapons of mass destruction that it doesn't acknowledge and hasn't signed the non-proliferation treaty. So, so the money we're sending to Israel is in blatant violation of U.S. law, and every member of the Congress is well aware of this.
Yeah, and Israel refuses to sign the nuclear non-proliferation treaty.
Right, they won't sign it.
UN charter. The UN has passed resolutions demanding that they do so.
Israel has violated more UN resolutions than any other nation. I mean, it's not even close. I mean, and their abuse of the Palestinian people is simply grotesque. They're running the world's largest concentration camp in Gaza, for example.
Yeah,
and
in fact, the Egyptian, people want to talk. Sorry, I just interrupted you.
Go right ahead.
Over in Egypt, we've had, the turmoil for the last few years, and people want to talk about how the Egyptians are paying for it. Really, it's the Gazans because the Egyptian military, which there are secret links to Israeli intelligence, closed all the tunnels. There are no more tunnels from Egypt into Gaza.
And, all the allegations about anti-Semitism are simply a political stunt because
all the Semites in Palestine are actually that, in Palestine.
That's exactly right, Jim.
Real Semites.
The definition of what it is to be a Semite is it's a linguistic classification. And those who are the bona fide Semites in the Middle East include the Palestinians and the other Arabs, not the Israelis, most of whom immigrated from other countries and aren't Semites at all.
Yeah, they're mostly
This is
Khazar
one of
Russians.
the ironies, and of course they used Western guilt over the Holocaust, which has been greatly exaggerated for political effect, so that any time anyone raises the most mild criticism of actions taken by the government of Israel, no matter how improper they may be, they're immediately attacked as being anti-Semitic and even a Holocaust denier. Well, the fact of the matter is,
I'm a Holocaust denier.
well, I'm certainly a Holocaust revisionist, because if you look into the matter,
well, they've turned it into an industry.
An industry, indeed. And this claim of 6 million, Jews having died in the Holocaust appears to be an issue of theology. It's not accurate history.
The math doesn't add up.
The math doesn't add up. And if you go to the, International Committee of the Red Cross, which was visiting the concentration camps and keeping copious records, I'd say you might be able to justify 10% of that number if you include the gypsies, the Jews, and the mentally and physically infirm. You might get around 600,000. I have a...
Well, 8 million civilian Germans died through the course of World War II, Jew or otherwise.
That's a very important point to make, Jim, because we were firebombing the cities of Germany, the civilian cities, using napalm, which happens to be a chemical weapon, by the way, and brought about a staggering number of deaths. At the Nuremberg Tribunal, it was declared that collective punishment was declared a war crime. Well, the Allies had been committing massive collective punishment on the German civilians, and in fact, it even interdicted the railroad lines, so that although it does not appear to have been a policy of Hitler because of the bombing of the railroad lines, they were unable to resupply the concentration camps, which led to mass starvation, not as a matter of deliberate policy, but as a consequence of the Allied bombing.
And the truth is, Jim, in order to have gassed and then incinerated 6 million bodies, it would have taken all of the energy, literally all of the gas and coal that Germany possessed. They wouldn't have even been able to go to war. They wouldn't have been able to fight the war, the Eastern or the Western Front, because all of their energy would have been going towards gassing and incinerating 6 million Jews. The numbers just aren't there. Now, I don't want to, turn it into that, but, the truth is,
let me just add
it's been turned into an industry.
Let me just add one more point. That term 6 million was already being bandied about as early as 1900.
Yeah.
So you're talking about, 3 or 4 decades before these alleged events were taking place. It appears to have a theological foundation that 6 million Jews must be consumed in fire before Israel can prevail or flourish. And this appears to have been the origin. Really, it's a matter of mythology, not of historical fact.
Okay, so we've established that deep intelligence-wise and policy-wise, in the hallowed halls of most of the governments, you're going to find AIPAC-type lobbies.
Oh, absolutely.
Right now in Syria is a powder keg that's just wait. Remember, Damascus is the oldest populated city on the planet.
They're going all out in this case, and I'm concerned that they're using information obtained by the NSA to attempt to extort members of Congress to support this absurd scheme. I mean, just here's a simple point to make. Doctors Without Borders have reported that the total number who died in these gas attacks was actually 355, and yet Kerry and Obama are talking about over 1,400, including 400 children. But that all appears to be an imaginary number, fictional. They just made up for political purposes. Now,
because now they're saying 500 children died.
And ask yourself, how many are going to die if we start sending cruise missiles into Syria? I mean, the number is going to be staggering, and it's going to be a whole lot of innocent civilians having nothing to do with nothing.
Yeah,
Jim, I have yet to hear a single mainstream media spokesman address either the international law violation of the Constitution, violation of his oath, which makes it an impeachable offense point, or that the collateral damage from these cruise missiles is going to be overwhelmingly greater. We're going to kill tens of thousands of Syrians. In response for the actual death of 355 that was not committed by the Assad government, but appears to have been done by the rebels.
Right, and not only that, but where are they going? There's already 2 million refugees that have fled Syria, just like in Iraq. 4 million displaced and refugees all over. Not one politician here is talking about what they're going to do to help the already the 2 million people who have fled Syria.
And bear in mind, Obama says that we must retaliate against Syria to preserve international norms and laws, when in fact we would be violating international law. I'm reminded of the stories from Vietnam that we had to destroy the village in order to save it. We have to kill Syrians in order to protect them and violate international law in order to preserve it. Absurd.
Yeah, we Jim, even the talk of launching cruise missiles into Syria is a violation of international law.
Yeah, well, it's a form of an assault, when we talk about assault and battery. Assault is actually threatening somebody. The battery is when you follow through and actually hit them, for example.
Yeah, because the threat has already caused a massive influx of refugees leaving Syria. Just the threat alone of cruise missiles and the buildup of American warships in the Mediterranean.
So it's not Assad who's violating international law here, but the United States. And notice
Assad's doing what any dictator would do when he's attacked. He's trying to hold his power. And
the whole thing was contrived because this so-called rebel group was not an indigent movement. This was mercenaries who were financed by Israel, Saudi Arabia, Qatar. I mean, it's completely disgusting. I have reports that we've already had troops on the ground in Syria for as much as 2 years, committing no end of mischief. You can go in and slaughter a village, and claim that it's done by the government, but all this appears to have been done by these mercenaries.
Right, and they're stirring up. That's right out of the Gladio, handbook. That's not necessarily for the American people's consumption. What they've done is they've terrorized the local population.
Yeah, absolutely. It's
terror. Don't make no mistake. It's terror.
And what most Americans don't realize either is that Syria was on our playbook. I mean, when General Wesley Clark, whom I was embarrassed to see on television yesterday, supporting the idea of a strike on Syria, returned from serving as Supreme Commander of Allied Forces Europe to the Pentagon, he was confronted with a plan to destabilize 7 Arab countries in the next 5 years. And of course, I mean,
he was on TV yesterday.
He was on TV yesterday.
An attack on Syria. I missed that because
very embarrassing, in my opinion. I mean, I have thought he was a good guy because he revealed revealed this plan. Yeah, which was an extension of the Project for the New American Century, exactly as you're observing. I mean, to really understand what's going on, you have to go back to the demise of the Soviet Union in 1990-91. Which left the United States as a sole remaining superpower. And we had these eager beaver neocons who thought we could establish a new American empire that would endure for the next 100 years if only we could move American forces aggressively into the Middle East and then exert military and diplomatic influence outward from that geopolitically sensitive region. If only the American people would realize that we had this unique opportunity, but which they bemoan might be very slow, and American people might have a slow learning curve if there weren't some traumatic catalyzing event, such as, and they actually use the phrase, a new Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, and they're still using it now, because now if you turned on the TV last night, every news network out there likens 9/11 to Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, and it's just completely ridiculous. But the fact of the matter is these events of 9/11 were all staged. I mean, there's no evidence that any of the hijackers were aboard any of those planes. All of the phone calls from all 4 flights were fabricated or faked. All 4 of the crash sites, in fact, were contrived, albeit in different ways. And that's a very interesting story all by itself. Then there was no investigation by the NTSB for the first time in its history when an FBI official was asked, why there'd been no investigation. Normally, remember, they'll methodically piece together an aircraft. They'll find a big warehouse and they'll put it together piece by piece. They do it in extreme cases like TW-800.
Flight 103. They
all
of them.
TW-800 appears to have been shot down by a missile fired by an American submarine in Long Island Sound, for
Off
God's
the coast
sake.
of New York City, yeah.
Hundreds of witnesses who saw the missile rise from the ocean and hit the plane, and yet the government denied it. I mean, it's all completely ridiculous. In fact, it's fairly astonishing, Jim, that we have now actually acknowledged that we were responsible for the coup that overthrew the democratically elected government of Iran back in, 1953?
1954, Mossadegh.
54, Mossadegh, and then, replace him with a Shah who was a brutal dictator. I mean, he murdered, tens of thousands of Iranians, and the United States was responsible for that. There's no way in which we have clean hands in the Middle East. So when Wesley Clark revealed that we had this plan where the final two nations on the hit list were Syria and Iran, which technically, of course, is not Arab, but is actually Persian,
They're Persians.
Yeah. And again, has one of the oldest civilizations in history. I mean, we're talking about dismantling all these modern, sophisticated Arab states, where Iraq, for example, had a national health care system, a national public education system, had infrastructure providing reliable water and electricity, had antiquities and artifacts dating back thousands of years. Thousands of years. And we dismantled all of that. I mean, you can't get reliable water and electricity in Iraq today.
They have the highest instance of birth defect.
Oh, we'll get to that.
Twins.
Yeah, absolutely, we'll get to that because, the United States has been playing dirty all over the world.
Right. All right, Jim. It's September 11th, so I suppose it's good we can segue into the topic now.
Yeah.
You have to understand.
How ironic, because this Syrian thing, which is so much on the front page today of every newspaper in the world, is a direct consequence of 9/11. 9/11 was the instrumentality that provided the pseudo-justification for launching these wars of aggression, the so-called war on terror. And yet it was all based on fabricated, faked data and information. I mean...
H.W. Bush and Dick Cheney, if you recall, were instrumental in the first Operation Desert Storm.
Dick Cheney may have been the most malevolent figure to ever occupy high office in the history of the United States.
Amen.
If you go back, to World War II, I mentioned the use of napalm and firebombing. I mean, that's a chemical weapon. We did it again in Korea. In Vietnam, we used Agent Orange, which is a chemical weapon, caused all kinds of medical problems for American forces. Even in the first Gulf War, we used, there was something going on there that caused so-called Gulf War syndrome that may or may not have been from the use of depleted uranium, which is, has a half-life about 4.8 billion years, which is equal to the scientific estimates of the age of the Earth. I mean, this stuff is going to be around for a long time. And when you talk about Fallujah, there's an international expert on the connection between cancer and its causes, especially in relation to radioactive materials, by the name of Christopher Busby, who went to Fallujah in the expectation he would discover that this stunning incidence of birth defects, where like 1/4 of Iraqi pregnancies are wind up in miscarriages or stillbirths, and 3/4 of those born live now have massive genetic defects. I'm talking about like the internal organs out on the outside of the body, or having a skull with no brain, or missing arms and legs, all this kind of thing.
Leukemia. They have leukemia like we get the flu here now.
Well, he believed, Jim, going in that he would be able to track this back to the use of depleted uranium. To his astonishment, however, it wasn't depleted uranium. It was enriched uranium from some new class of nuclear weapons that we've been using in the Middle East. These are probably neutron bombs, which, by the way, in mini or micro versions, appear to have been used to blow apart the Twin Towers. I mean, when you get deeply enough into the study of these things, you find how interconnected it all is, and how the sources can only have been the highest level, very sophisticated military entities, including the United States and Israel. I mean,
so 19 radical Islamists from Saudi Arabia with $4 box cutters pretty much dismantled and embarrassed a $1 trillion defense and intelligence apparatus.
Well, the whole story is so absurd on its face. Yeah, 15 of the 19 were from Saudi Arabia. The number from Iraq was 0. Therefore, if you took the evidence on its face value, we ought to be attacking Saudi Arabia. In fact, one of the rumors floating
And
around
Israel.
is that Putin had implied that if there were, United States were to attack Saudi Arabia, he'd retaliate by attacking, were to invade Syria, that he'd retaliate by taking out Saudi Arabia. Which might even be a good idea. I'm telling you, the Saudis have played such a malevolent role behind the scenes in so many cases. I mean, this is a real hotbed of extremism.
That's where the money goes. That's where the money comes from. Even if it's funneled from the United States, it goes through Saudi Arabia, it goes up through Turkey, in this instance through Libya, then into Turkey, then into Syria.
It's really stunning. It's really stunning.
And if you look at 9/11, which is what we're going to discuss now, you see Mossad, and you see Saudi Arabia, along with American intelligence. What you don't really see is a whole lot of Al-Qaeda.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Al-Qaeda, in fact, was our contrivance. We invented Al-Qaeda. It was, the resistance in Afghanistan to the Soviet occupation of that country. Osama bin Laden was our man in Afghanistan. You know, you go to a film like Charlie Wilson's War, talks about the United States providing Stinger missiles to the resistance there, and it leaves out that Osama bin Laden was instrumental in all of that. And, of course, when he was first confronted with the news about 9/11, he explained he had nothing to do with it, that it was contrary to the tenets of the Koran to murder innocent women and children, that while he was opposed to the stationing of American forces in Saudi Arabia, the home of the two most holy sites in Islam, Mecca and Medina, it was apparent that there was a government within the government that wanted to pin the responsibility for 9/11 on Muslims. And interestingly, Jim, there's another source that's made a similar observation, a guy who was in a position to know, William Jefferson Clinton, who himself observed there's a government within the government and that he did not control it. Are we there?
Yeah, we're still here. I thought we dropped off, but we didn't. Yeah, Bill Clinton. Yeah, he doesn't. Well, he's the head of the Clinton crime family, but yeah, he took his orders.
Yeah, I'm not saying
he takes his orders just like everybody else.
He at least did some good for the country while he was the president. He took us from massive deficits to massive projected surpluses, which George W. Bush immediately gutted by saying we got a $3 trillion surplus, so we can afford $1 trillion in tax cuts for the rich and another $1 trillion for defense, and still have $1 trillion left over for social. But he was using the Enron technique known as telescoping, where you treat anticipated revenues that'll eventually come in as though they were already on the books. So by making those tax cuts, he guaranteed that we'd never attain the surpluses that would have followed almost inevitably from the economy as Bill Clinton left it. So,
True. And all the records, the investigation into the Enron scandal were destroyed.
They were in Building 7. Many Americans don't even realize that there was a third skyscraper that was destroyed in New York beyond the two Twin Towers that wasn't hit by any aircraft, had no jet fuel-based fires, where incidentally those fuel fires couldn't have caused the steel to weaken, much less melt. Jesse Ventura has a gift for making complex points in a simple way. He observes that his camping stove, which is made of steel, burns propane, which is a higher temperature than kerosene, which is the constituent of jet fuel, ironically, and yet it doesn't melt. So, this whole thing is completely ridiculous. But here you have this Building 7 that comes down at 5:20 in the afternoon, about 7 hours after the destruction of the Twin Towers, and not hit by any aircraft. And it comes down, all the floors coming down at the same time in a classic controlled demolition. And when it's done, there's a stack of pancakes or debris equal to about 12% of the original 47 floors, about 5.5 floors. When the Twin Towers are destroyed, however, it's completely different. They're blowing apart in every direction from the top down. All the floors are remaining stationary. They're being converted into millions of cubic yards of very fine dust. And when it's over, believe it or not, Jim, they're destroyed below ground level. I even had Father
William
Frank
Rodriguez.
I'll come back to Willie, but there's a I even had Father Frank Morales from St. Mark's Episcopal Church, who was a first responder, on my shows twice, and both times he emphasized below ground level. And in fact, in some of the photographs, you can see it very clearly. One photograph I use in my presentations on 9/11 is looking down on Building 6, which has this huge scooped-out center. And over to the left in the background, you can see this massive stack of debris from the 47-story Building 7, 5.5 floors. And in the immediate right foreground, where the North Tower, Building 1, stood, there's nothing. So you got 5.5 floors from a 47, and you have nothing for a 110-story, but 12% should have been 13 or 14 floors if it had collapsed. I mean, the government has just been lying about every aspect of this. Where
and
it's not
controlled
even
demolition just happens to have 40 trucks in the area. The whole thing stinks to high heaven.
Rudy Giuliani has lined up 110 dump trucks to start toting in. I mean, to start removing the debris. And what most people don't realize is they were toting in. They were full of dirt when they came in, and they were dumping the dirt on the debris pile. So if you track it across time, you find it's actually growing for the first several days because they're adding all of these thousands of tons of dirt, which is the sort of thing that was done at Chernobyl to absorb the effects of the radioactivity. We've now discovered massive evidence. There's been this theory. I founded Scholars for 9/11 Truth in December of 2005 and invited Steve Jones, who is a physicist from Brigham Young University, to be my co-chair. Steve had been studying dust samples that were gathered from some apartments in New York, and claimed that there were these little chips of what he called nanothermite that he attributed responsibility for blowing the buildings apart. He told me in June of 2006 in Los Angeles at the Sheraton Hotel in the lobby, where Alex Jones had organized the American Scholars Conference, which would have the great benefit that C-SPAN would film the panel discussion on Sunday, where there were four of us, and then Alex was moderating. One was Steve Jones was there, then Bob Bowman, now deceased, who was had a PhD in nuclear engineering from Caltech and was a director of the Star Wars program under two presidents. There was Webster Tarpley, who's published 9/11 Synthetic Terror Made in the USA, one of our experts on covert operations, and me as the founder of Scholars. And it ran an hour and 45 minutes, and C-SPAN would subsequently broadcast it 7 or 8 times at good times, which I think actually had the effect of shattering the kind of artificial constraints from public discussion of 9/11. But the fact of the matter is, the day before on Saturday, I had approached him in the lobby and said, Steve, I said, are you convinced that nanothermite can do perform all these feats you're attributing to it, including, pulverizing steel and pulverizing
turning
concrete?
Turning humans into particulate bone matter.
And
that means powder, like talcum powder.
Yeah, and he assured me, yes, it could. But the fact is that I was skeptical then, and in fact thought we needed to broaden our consideration of alternatives, so that on November 11th of 2006, actually for the first time, I interviewed a woman named Judy Wood, who had a completely different view about directed energy weapons. And I thought that was fascinating because it so broadened the range of alternatives. But Steve and Kevin Ryan and others were very upset at this and actually split from Scholars to form their own organization because they didn't want to consider alternative views.
Right.
I am convinced now that while Judy's theory is fascinating, she really has...
We're all familiar with Judy Wood.
Yeah, well, she hasn't really been able to nail it down. The idea of directed energy weapons, as she defines it, is a form of energy that's more powerful than conventional. It can be directed, which happens to also fit mini and micro neutron bombs. And in fact, it's ironic in 2 different ways, because Steve Jones and his people gave us the impression they'd done a thorough study of the dust. But in fact, the U.S. Geological Survey obtained vastly more samples from, a dozen different locations in New York, subjected it to a much more extensive study, and discovered all kinds of elements that would not have been present had this not been a nuclear event, including barium and strontium and lanthanum and lithium and tritium. I mean, it's just astonishing how many elements are present
there. Rivers of molten metal. Lava. Rivers of lava.
So you mentioned, by the way, William Rodriguez, Willie, who came here to Madison and gave a talk. I know Willie fairly well, and during dinner afterwards, he was explaining to me and Kevin Barrett how the sub-basements of the North Tower filled with water. And this was from an explosion, by the way.
Yeah, because the basement, it's contained. They're below sea level.
Well, let me explain what was going on, Jim. This was from explosions in the sub-basements that occurred 14 and 17 seconds before the alleged impact of the planes with the buildings.
Right.
So yet the planes haven't even hit the buildings, and you've had these massive explosions in the sub-basements of the North and the South Tower.
Where was the first attack on the World Trade Center located? In the sub-levels. And the funny thing is, they were only a few columns off.
Well, but that was FBI seems to have had a role in setting that up. I mean, that was a contrived event. It didn't have any significant causal consequences for the integrity of the buildings.
But you have to get at the base first, is what I was.
What we're talking about here in the sub-basement, Jim, is massive explosions that led to the sub-basement filling with water, among its other effects. And when Willie told me that, I realized that one of the purposes, maybe even the main purpose, was to drain the sprinkler systems of water so they couldn't extinguish the very modest fires that remained after the jet fuel, which appears
the firefighters were convinced they could knock down the fires in the World Trade Center.
Oh, that's right. I think that's what precipitated. We had a fire chief getting up to, the 78th, 79th floor. He said there are two fires. I think a couple lines, we can put this out easily. And that's when the demolition sequence was initiated. Because once the fires were put out, there was no pseudo-justification for what they would claim to be the collapse of the building. And of course, the top three floors of the South Tower started to tilt to the side and appear to have been blown as one. If we're right in our reasoning about this, and I have no reason at present to believe we're mistaken, then it looks as though they were blowing the buildings in like 10 cubes of 10 floors per second.
Yeah, they had to create a vacuum in order.
So in the North Tower, you had all 110 floors standing. So if you blow 10 floor cubes per second, that'll take 11 seconds. Well, that's just the amount of time NIST calculates. In the South Tower, because the top three cubes tilted over as one and were blown as one, only 9 seconds, which also agrees with NIST. So that it looks very much as though when you combine the dust evidence and the massive epidemic of odd cancers among the first responders, which is at a rate overwhelmingly higher than in the normal population, you have a tremendous body of proof substantiating that this was a nuclear event. And that, of course, directly leads to who was responsible, since this could only have been done by the American military or the Israeli military.
Because of the presence of nanotechnology. You can't just create that in your basement.
That's right. And, of course, I mean, the idea that 19 Islamic terrorists who weren't even aboard any of these planes, I mean, one of the key points that David Ray Griffin makes in his book, The 9/11 Commission Report, Omissions and Distortions, is that a half a dozen or more of these guys turned up alive and well the following day. Even Mohammed Atta's father explained his son had called him, terrified, to explain he had nothing to do with it, but he was worried, for his life, because undoubtedly there was an attempt to kill him, to remove a witness who would refute the official account. But intelligence experts have converged in the conclusion there were only two intel agencies in the world that could have pulled this off. Those were the CIA and the Mossad. And in the case of 9/11, they appear to have been operating together.
Yeah, we have the dancing Israelis. We have the George Washington Bridge with the van full of explosives.
Urban Moving Systems, Odega Messaging Center. If you go to the website, Israel Did 9/11, All the Proof in the World, which is by its title slightly exaggerated because the neocons in the Department of Defense were responsible for the stand down of the U.S. Air Force. Rumsfeld even changed the SOP for interdiction of hijacked aircraft in June to make sure there'd be no U.S. Air Force response. Then they conducted a massive phony terrorist drills that morning that put little false blips all over the screens of all the air traffic controllers. And even after it was said to have gone live, they left those little blips on the screen, Jim. I mean, the first thing you do And isn't it amazing how just the day we happen to have this drill that we have these the 4 aircraft allegedly being hijacked.
According to Webster Tarpley, that's SOP.
Yeah, that's right. It happened, for example, in the London bombing. Anyone who hasn't seen the Maud Dibbs and 7/7 ripple effect must watch it, because there in 1 hour you go from the beginning to the end of the planning of the drill to the execution of the live drill, where the 4 patsies, these young Middle Eastern men, didn't even make it to their locations on time in order to serve that role, because the train from Luton was canceled, so that they're pinning the blame for these blasts, which just happened to take place at the same tube train stations where the drill had simulated blasts taking place. I mean, you know, it's not.
And Jim, the fact is that 9/11 had been accidentally almost prevented numerous times. You know, it was you have the the Saudis giving out giving warning or red labeled citizens passports into the United States. You have what's his name there that told us about the Arabs taking air flight courses in schools around the United States, and how the State Department and the intelligence said, no, that's common. They always do that. We have the best schools in the world. That's why they're here. I mean, so the event couldn't have happened unless you had Mossad and CIA, everywhere, whether they planned it or not. I mean, that that Al Qaeda is in their fold.
But of course they did plan it. I mean,
Yes,
this is very important to understand that this could not have come to pass merely by accident. So when you have Condoleezza Rice, talking about the title of a report that says that, Al Qaeda may be planning, or Osama bin Laden may be planning to hit the United States with planes, she even claimed that they had no idea that aircraft could be used as weapons, and yet that's completely absurd. Even the Pentagon had conducted a simulation of a plane, actually a Boeing 757, hitting the Pentagon less than a year before 9/11, and of course it was supposed to be a 757 that hit the Pentagon, where the official account, Jim, remarkably enough, is not even aerodynamically or physically possible. You got this Boeing 757 traveling over 500 miles an hour, barely skimming the ground and hitting all these lampposts. But I've discussed this with aeronautical engineers, and it's not even aeronautically possible for a plane at that speed to get that close to the ground, because of the accumulation of a pocket of compressed gas, in this case air, that would have kept it at 60 or even 80 feet above the ground. Couldn't have got that close as a matter of the laws of aerodynamics. And then the idea of hitting these lampposts
at 600 miles an hour, 500.
Well, 500, yeah. By Newton's third law, the equal and opposite reaction, the effects of a plane traveling over 500 miles an hour hitting stationary lampposts is the same as if the plane were stationary and were hit by lampposts traveling over 500 miles an hour. Would have ripped the ring off. The fuel stored in the wing would have burst into flame. It would have cartwheeled, its tail flipped off. It would have made a mess on the ground. In fact, we have these photographs taken after the 2 civilian lime green fire trucks show up and extinguish the very modest fire, that shows the lawn is perfectly clear, green, unblemished. You expect Tiger to show up to practice his putting.
Yeah. And we do have eyewitness reports.
Better for the FedEx, because he's lost his #1 standing for the FedEx by his terrible performance in this last round. We'll see what happens. It's great to see.
There are, James, eyewitness reports of military aircraft flying along the alleged flight path of what.
Well, this is all pretty bizarre. It does appear, and there's a group called CIT, a Citizens Investigative Team, that interviewed a whole lot of witnesses after they realized that there were reports of a plane approaching on a whole different trajectory that was like due west to. Well, yeah, heading right into the West Wing, but that it flew over the building.
Well, I'm going to have to track down this problem. I'm not going to be able to have guests on the show if my Skype's going to keep shutting off like that. Well, some of the points that we were just about to make, I'm hoping I can get Jim to hop back on here. I'm not sure why we got disconnected. I have a feeling it's my own Skype. Oh, man, I'm so embarrassed. I'm going to try to call James back right now and get him on. He might just be disgusted and not want to be on. Yeah, I'm back. We're having problems with our Skype. Now my connection with the professor is, he's listening. Well, I could keep him on, but I don't want to. I don't want to keep doing this where I keep getting disconnected. It happened to me yesterday also, and now he can't seem to connect or he won't answer. He's probably talking away. Doesn't even realize we're disconnected. Listen, I want to apologize, but the point is, here today on the anniversary of September 11th, 2001. That we were lied to. Oh, man. What a train wreck. We were lied to. I'm going to have to figure out why these Skypes keep doing this. But one of the things that I really wanted to talk, I was just going to finish up because we mentioned Newton and we mentioned the laws of physics. And, yeah, I'm a little embarrassed, guys. Allegedly the top part of the towers came down but met no resistance. Anybody who's worked with wood knows that when you hit a nail with a hammer it bounces back. Well, that is by virtue of physics, actual laws, mathematics that can be used in equations. And NIST and all the other teams, the official teams, seem to miss the fact that we have this little thing called physics, laws that the universe operates by where'd
I leave off?
Oh, James, we were talking about the Pentagon. Since we only have, I'm a little embarrassed. My Skype, I seem to be having a problem with my Skype or maybe the network Skype, but it cut me off. So we were talking about the Pentagon.
I even explained that the official story of the Pentagon is neither aerodynamically nor physically possible.
Yes. And they had to get rid of the evidence of the missing $3 trillion.
I talk about the witnesses that CIT uncovered.
That's where we left off.
Reported seeing a plane flying north of the Citgo station when the official trajectory required it come in south, so that and that a friend of mine from JFK Research, Roy Schaefer, had a trucker buddy, Dave Ball, who was in front of the building at the time, who told Roy that he'd seen a plane fly toward the building and then swerve over it. When I told Roy, I said it's important to get Dave on the air to make his findings. It was knowledge public. Roy checked with him, and he was hesitant to do it. And within 2 weeks, he was found dead in an abandoned building. And then I turned to discussing about Barry Jennings, who was in the building 7. He'd gone there because Rudy Giuliani had a command and control center. Half-eaten sandwiches, steaming coffee. Apartment said, "We got to get you out of there." There were explosions going on there that very morning. He was stepping over dead bodies. He reported it to witnesses. You can find it on YouTube. But yet, within a couple of days of the find, dead. Found dead.
People, we're good people. We're God-fearing people.
James.
We're being led by leaders who are godly. We're lost. All right? Don't let them fool you into thinking you're lost and you don't have to care. They can call us whatever they want, but they can't make us hate.
I'd rather die than be a slave to thee.